Hello, so in this webinar, we will be discussing the topic of racism and adverse childhood experiences, hereby referred to as ACEs. This webinar will be led by myself, Nyla Lindo, and my colleagues Jocelyn Valdez and Tahaya Boswell. So our objective for this webinar is to advocate for a race-informed, trauma-informed care approach to support students in New York City schools. Through this webinar, local policymakers and school districts will learn about current ACE screening measures and what they lack, and how to incorporate a race-informed, trauma-informed care approach in schools by training staff to recognize racism and provide support to students using several frameworks. Increasing directed funding for staff, training, and resources will have the greatest impact in improving the lives of children of color with ACEs. Established policies and protocols will also prove to support these students living in vulnerable communities. So before we begin, we would like to present you with the following disclaimer. We will be discussing sensitive topics that may elicit feelings of discomfort for some members of the audience. We encourage you to take care of yourself and feel free to pause and step away during the presentation if necessary. This webinar will consist of 6 sections. Section 1, we will provide background information on what ACEs are, their potential health outcomes, and possible signs that someone may be experiencing ACEs. Section 2 will introduce the topic of racism and its impact. Section 3 will cover existing trauma-informed interventions in schools. Section 4 will describe pre-intervention efforts to ensure schools are ready to implement intervention. Section 5 will propose the implementation of a race-centered focus on trauma-informed care and how to train teachers and staff on using this race-centered approach. The 6th and final section will go over available funding that can be allocated to this training. So we'll begin with general information on ACEs. So what are ACEs? ACEs are traumatic experiences that occur in childhood that can increase a child's risk for lifelong medical and mental illnesses. ACEs are shown to have an intensifying effect on negative health outcomes. This means, as the number of ACEs increase, the negative outcomes, including health, social, and financial factors, may also increase. ACEs can result in physiological changes in the brain and other organs that can alter how children respond to stress and impact the child's learning ability, social skills, and other long-term health problems. Experiencing adverse childhood events is very common across the United States. According to the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, nearly 2/3, or 57.8%, of all adult Americans have experienced at least one ACE. More people experience adversity than do not. Research and related literature have generally explored 3 categories of ACEs: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Abuse can be either physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect can be physical or emotional, and household dysfunction can include one or more parents or guardians who have mental illness, who are incarcerated, who experience domestic violence, who engage in substance abuse, or who are divorced. Experiencing ACEs can happen in the household, in the community, or in the environment and can cause stress. This image helps us visualize the ways in which ACEs can affect us in these different realms and how ACEs can quickly add up when we consider their many sources. It also reminds us that in order to properly address ACEs, we must use a multidimensional, comprehensive approach. Our push for race-informed, trauma-informed care in schools will combat several pathways leading to ACEs in children and will improve their lives. Next, my colleague Tahaya will now go over the behaviors to look out for.
Thank you, Nyla. Staff, including teachers, counselors, and any social workers or psychologists, may not know how to identify children with ACEs and what behaviors to look for. Training staff to recognize the variety of ways trauma can manifest is vital. We present you with 9 clues that a child has experienced trauma or adverse childhood events. Please feel free to pause the webinar to familiarize yourself with these indicators. Individuals who experience ACEs are at an increased risk for obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, depression, suicide attempts, behavioral problems, and others. As the number of ACEs experienced increases, the risk for poor health outcomes also increases. If we can reach children and target them with appropriate intervention, we can prevent many of these adverse health outcomes. The health effects of ACEs can be delayed until well into adulthood and include the leading causes of death. Preventing ACEs in childhood could substantially reduce the number of adults living with many chronic physical and mental illnesses. For instance, the CDC estimates that addressing ACEs could reduce the number of adults with depression by as much as 44%. While ACEs are very important influences on health, experiencing ACEs does not mean you are sure to experience poor health. ACEs are not the sole determining factor of your life's course, and there are ways to lower your risk for serious health outcomes with resilience and protective factors, which we will go over later in the presentation. We have the opportunity to disrupt these consequences by surrounding children with adults who are knowledgeable on ACEs and are trained to act appropriately. In this chart, we present the estimated cost of ACE-related health outcomes in New York State. In the United States, it has been estimated that $748 billion is lost in direct health costs and loss of production costs. Of that, New York State contributes $128 billion. Early intervention is a key element to lowering this cost burden. For more information, please refer to our pamphlet titled "The Cost Burden of ACEs in New York State." Take a moment to review the information presented on the slide. Now we will move on to discuss the connection between racism and ACEs. In the United States, the risk of experiencing ACEs is not equal across racial groups. 61% of Black non-Hispanic children and 51% of Hispanic children have experienced at least one ACE, compared with 40% of white non-Hispanic children and only 23% of Asian non-Hispanic children. In every category of ACEs, the prevalence of ACEs is lowest among Asian non-Hispanic children, and in most divisions is highest among Black non-Hispanic children. Socially disadvantaged groups, and Black youth in particular, are also more likely to report multiple ACEs. Several racial ethnic minority groups are at greater risk for experiencing 4 or more ACEs. While 60% of white non-Hispanic children have had no ACEs, this is the case for only 49% of Hispanic children and 39% of Black non-Hispanic children. Data from the National Survey of Children's Health measure 9 ACEs. The 8 listed in this table and one additional question that asks parents to report on how often their child was treated or judged unfairly because of their race or ethnicity. It was not included in this study's analysis because of the subjectivity of the question and because parents may not be reliable reporters of their child's experience in this area. Take a moment to pause and review this table, depicting how the prevalence of ACEs in children differ by race. Boxes highlighted in yellow mean that the listed prevalence is significantly higher from the reference group, white non-Hispanic children. We can see that Black youth were the most likely to experience 6 of the 8 measured ACEs. My colleague Jocelyn will now describe instances of racism in more depth.
Thank you, Tahaya. So should racism be considered an ACE? First, let's think about racial trauma. Racial trauma refers to the stressful impact of one's experience with racism and discrimination. It is the emotional and psychological response to racism-related incidents that are unexpected, experienced as threatening, and result in significant psychological stress. Racial trauma may be often thought about in terms of individual-level stressors, such as racial discrimination. However, it can also occur on the community level. One clear example is the case of historical trauma, which will be discussed on the next slide. Racism-related experiences can cause emotional and psychological injury, which can threaten a person's sense of safety and security. Stress reactions reflecting racial trauma include increased vigilance and suspicion, increased sensitivity to threat, sense of a foreshortened future, and more maladaptive responses to stress such as aggression or substance use. While racism is not yet officially an ACE category, racism clearly contributes to many ACEs and it disproportionately affects health outcomes. For these reasons, the consequences of racism should be treated as an ACE and intervention is therefore necessary. Historical trauma is a form of racial trauma that impacts entire communities. It refers to cumulative emotional and psychological wounding as a result of traumatic group experiences transmitted across generations within a community. This includes how the legacies from enslavement of African Americans, displacement and murder of Native Americans, incarceration of Japanese Americans in internment camps after Pearl Harbor, and Jews who endured the Holocaust have been transferred to current descendants of these groups and others. The impact is not only about what has happened in the past, but also about what is still happening in the present. This trauma has implications for the physical, social, and psychological health of individuals and communities. Caregivers whose family members were directly exposed to historical trauma may have inherited biological changes in how they respond to trauma, including heightened stress responses. Witnessing or experiencing racism, discrimination, or structural prejudice can have a profound impact on the mental health of individuals exposed to these events. Racial trauma reactions are exacerbated by the cumulative impact of exposure to multiple traumas. This is particularly important for youth in low-income urban communities where there is an increased risk for community violence and victimization. Racism manifests in various ways, including individual, interpersonal, structural, and institutional levels. Racism is most often understood in terms of individual or interpersonal experiences. Data from the National Survey of Children's Health reports that individual and interpersonal racism are significantly associated with all other ACEs. Black children who experience racial discrimination are at increased risk for ACEs, such as witnessing or being a victim of neighborhood violence and having a parent or guardian in jail or prison. However, the National Survey of Children's Health does not measure the effect of institutional and systemic racism. This has important health implications for children who cannot change these larger systems. Institutional or systemic racism is the racial inequity within institutions, such as places of employment or the government, via policies, laws, and practices. Racism and classism are systems of power that work together to exacerbate challenges for people of color. For example, the racial wealth gap refers to the higher prevalence of poverty and inability to accumulate wealth among communities of color, especially Black and Latinx groups. Because ACEs are more common among children living in poverty, the racial wealth gap contributes to the high prevalence of ACEs among children of color compared to white children. The racial wealth gap affects socioeconomic status, along with access to opportunities, educational attainment, and investment in communities. One study examined census tracts according to their levels of poverty and demonstrated that the poorest census tracts also, 1, have the highest proportion of young children, 2, have the least realized social, physical, and educational as well as economic capital, and 3, are highly racially segregated and separated from many sources of economic opportunity. To prevent ACEs, we must include strategies that intervene at the root level to generational poverty, structural racism, and historical disinvestment in communities of color. My colleague Nyla will now go over current ACE measurements and current events.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So a study conducted by McGuire, Jack, and colleagues studied the prevalence of certain ACEs among different racial and ethnic groups. The study objective was to understand whether groupings of ACEs are experienced similarly across racial groups. This study highlighted the fact that it is problematic to assume that findings in national data can apply universally to all groups. The 3 racial groups used in this study were non-Latinx white, Latinx, and non-Latinx Black. Findings showed that mental illness was significantly associated with a child's race or ethnicity. It also showed that race and ethnicity was significantly associated with discrimination. Now we will go over how racism is displayed through current events and can impact children. So first, we will begin with the COVID-19 pandemic. Behind all the following facts and statistics are individuals and communities whose disproportionate experiences related to COVID-19 are exacerbating ACEs, stress, and morbidity. These communities will need extra resources to battle the negative impacts. COVID-19 has most affected people routinely disadvantaged by social injustice created by the maldistribution of power, money, and resources. In general, people who are Black, American Indian, or live in low-income households are more likely to have an increased risk of COVID-19 related illness compared to white or higher income households. Black communities are far more likely to experience adverse housing conditions, crowded living environments, diminished access to health promoting resources, use of public transportation, and employment in sectors requiring close interaction with others. One study investigated the independent effects of race on COVID-19 incidence and mortality in US counties and found that Black race is associated with increased COVID-19 cases and deaths independent of comorbidities, poverty, access to healthcare, and other risk factors. Providing school staff with appropriate resources will ensure that students of color are receiving the support they need to combat the effects of the pandemic on creating and exacerbating ACEs. Next, we will go over the disproportionate impact of current events on Asians in America. The Asian American community in the United States has been consistently blamed for the pandemic and are increasingly becoming victims of discrimination and violence related to COVID-19. According to several reports, hate crimes against East Asians have increased dramatically since the start of the pandemic. More than 2,500 reports of these incidents have been reported between March and September of 2020, although this may not be the actual number since most incidents are not reported. The NYPD had to add a new crime category to capture this data, and it was reported that the number of hate crimes against Asians is 8 times greater than it was the year prior to the pandemic. While we mentioned earlier that Asian Americans have the lowest ACE prevalence compared to other racial groups, we are unsure how this will change once the pandemic is over and ACEs may increase for this group. Next, we will go over the disproportionate impact of current events on Black people in America. So Black Lives Matter, or BLM for short, is a movement that serves to shed light on unwarranted police violence against Black bodies. The targeting of Black people by the police officers instills fear, mistrust, and a feeling of hopelessness among Black people, as the individuals who are supposed to protect them are the ones targeting their lives. This is a form of institutional and interpersonal racism. Next, we will discuss the impact of the Trump administration. There were many actions undertaken by the Trump administration that jeopardized the lives of many people and that fueled prejudices across the country and heightened white supremacy. On January 27, 2017, former President Trump signed an executive order banning nationals of Muslim-majority countries from traveling into the United States. In the same week, he signed 2 other executive orders for the construction of the southern border wall and for barring sanctuary cities from receiving federal grants. Trump's zero-tolerance policy, enacted in April of 2018, separated more than 5,400 children from their parents at their southern border, and thousands more were kept in detention with their families. Children who are aware of these discriminatory actions by people in power and related institutions are more vulnerable to psychological injury, and they require more sensitive care with properly trained adults who understand their experiences. So, is racism an ACE? Yes. The next few sections will show us how to move forward. I will now hand the presentation over to Jocelyn to discuss existing interventions.
Thank you, Nyla. The Department of Education in New York City launched a number of programs this recent school year, including the Bridge to School initiative to train school leaders in trauma-informed practices, like how to create classroom structures that facilitate healing, identify students in crises, and procedures for compassionately supporting students struggling with grief and bereavement. Fund for Public Schools fundraised $1.9 million from nonprofit organizations to cover the training costs, and the training curriculum was developed by the University of Chicago's Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project. There's also a hotline available from the Child Mind Institute to help educators with any questions on best socio-emotional practices. the Department of Education also established a partnership with New York City Health and Hospitals for 26 schools to connect them with outpatient mental health clinics, and they place clinical mental health care providers in 350 schools. There are plans to deploy 150 social workers in neighborhoods hardest hit by COVID-19. With this existing foundation, it will be convenient to implement a race-informed lens and staff training practices to address students' needs. Moving forward, schools would have the greatest impact if there are more community-centered approaches with access to various resources, such as health clinics, food pantries, and art and music programs. Investing in socio-emotional supports can help mitigate any consequences from ACEs. We would like to highlight 2 other programs, including one at a middle school on the San Carlos Apache Reservation and one at an elementary school in Fort Worth, Texas. The Apache Reservation uses a trauma-informed approach with culturally competent training for their Native American students. They partnered with local agencies, developed a care center with calming rooms and therapists, and various other trauma-informed activities, such as utilizing drum circles to support students dealing with trauma. The elementary school in Fort Worth also restructured their school to include more teacher-student interactions, such as morning greetings, conversation circles, and exercises to understand children's current state of mind. These interventions allow for a paradigm shift in how schools respond to trauma and reveals the importance in emphasizing culture and restoring historical losses of culture. Race-informed, trauma-informed responses in New York City can also develop a culturally appropriate response for their students. Schools should fully understand the communities their students belong to and work with these communities to develop culturally appropriate practices that can help students heal. While it is important to implement these practices in schools, eventually this restructuring should extend into the community. Schools that have implemented a trauma-informed approach have seen drastic improvements in students' outcomes. At San Carlos Middle School, attendance improved from 84% in fall 2018 to 96% in spring 2019, and suspensions decreased from 33% to 7%. At John T. White Elementary School, there is a dramatic decrease in suspensions, in addition to students passing state exams for the first time, increasing teacher retention rates, improving the school rating, and improving test scores. Another school that implemented a trauma-informed approach was Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington. The administration restructured their school to support their students affected by ACEs. From 2010 to 2015, they saw 60% fewer office referrals, 75% fewer fights, 90% fewer suspensions, a 55% increase in math assessment scores, a 5-fold increase in graduation rates, and a 3-fold increase in seniors bound for college. This journey is documented in the film Paper Tigers. Implementing trauma-informed practices will benefit students and schools, and with more attention to the consequences of racism on students, these practices should further improve academic and health outcomes. Next, Tahaya will go over some pre-intervention efforts to set up schools for implementation, starting with the valuable frameworks.
Thank you, Jocelyn. The use of conceptual and theoretical frameworks provides a crucial foundation for implementation. They function as practical tools for planning, executing, and evaluating real-world intervention efforts. We plan to utilize 2 main frameworks to structure our efforts: critical race theory and the Healing Ethno-Racial Trauma Framework. Policymakers can work with schools to create legislation utilizing the approaches suggested to more effectively support children. Critical race theory is a framework which allows us to use a race-conscious approach to understand and address inequality and structural racism in order to find and implement solutions leading to justice. Whether implicit or explicit, race is consistently present in policy, practice, and the school environment. Because of this, the centrality of race is a core principle of critical race theory, since it is a recurring factor associated with a variety of disproportionate economic, educational, and health outcomes. Critical race theory underscores the importance in valuing unique lived experiences, commitment to social justice, interdisciplinary experiences, and voices of people of color, all while changing systems in place. Schools should utilize and incorporate knowledge around critical race theory into the pillars of trauma-informed care. Policy and practice can help to reduce the persistent discrimination towards students of color. This is particularly important for students of color who have also been exposed to adverse childhood experiences because they are often more vulnerable to internal and external stressors. The Healing Ethno-Racial Trauma Framework is grounded in trauma-informed care and addresses the impact of racism and other systems of oppression on the Latinx community, which can then be extended to other populations. This framework focuses on both the internal symptoms of trauma and the external intersecting systems of oppression that cause or exacerbate psychological distress. It utilizes 4 phases. First, spaces are established to allow for people to express themselves, to be affirmed, and to be acknowledged. Second, the spaces will allow people to reprocess and mourn losses associated with racial trauma. Third, spaces will allow people to integrate experiences of trauma and connect them to cultural elements and practices that heal. Fourth, spaces will allow people to create strategies for protecting, liberating, resisting, and organizing for social action. Each phase has a goal to assist education staff in helping individuals, families, and communities achieve growth, wellness, and healing. The main objective is to help students of color find relief, gain awareness, and cope with systemic oppression while encouraging resistance and protection from external factors causing trauma. With this framework in mind, schools can better serve their students of color and reduce the consequences of trauma. Next, Jocelyn will talk about setting the stage.
Thank you, Tahaya. After schools fully understand the 2 frameworks, they can reflect on how to best set up their spaces for their students. In order to demonstrate that schools recognize the impact of different traumas on students' academic performance, they need to establish a safe and brave environment to engage in. A safe environment should promote feeling secure within oneself and free of the risk of harm from others. In a trauma-informed school environment, psychological safety should be defined, potential triggers should be identified, and plans should be in place to reestablish safety. A brave environment should promote a willingness to take risks in order to engage openly. To create this environment, schools must highlight the importance of establishing a sense of safety and of developing trust for all students regardless of disagreements. In addition, schools need to set up methods to manage emotional responses while validating and de-escalating emotions when possible. And they need to check in with students consistently and learn when clinical intervention is necessary. It is okay for staff to acknowledge that they do not have all the answers regarding racism, bias, and privilege. All that matters is that they are truthful and respectful with their students in order to have conversations in healthy and constructive ways, even if it is difficult. Practicing having these conversations with other staff and adults can be helpful in navigating different scenarios. Local policymakers can help schools set the stage by establishing standardized guidelines for boundaries and methods of intervention across districts. This section will cover how to incorporate a race-informed, trauma-informed care approach in schools by training staff to recognize racism and provide support to students using appropriate frameworks. In order to fulfill trauma-informed care and responsive school leadership for students of color, there needs to be ongoing access to school counselors and, if applicable, social workers and psychologists. Many social workers are trained in complex trauma and treatment methods, and schools should make sure their social workers have the skill sets to recognize and respond to traumatic experiences among students. Teachers and counselors are also perfectly situated to respond to the impact of trauma on child development. Each have their own distinct responsibilities, but they should be utilized together in order to have the greatest impact. Any counselors, social workers, and psychologists can be trained to administer assessments on emotional and behavioral issues, and they can develop appropriate intervention plans. Teachers, counselors, and educational staff are trained to provide academic and socio-emotional support for students, and they should collaborate to give a well-rounded assessment of students. Although New York City plans to attain more social workers for schools, there are still not enough social workers or psychologists in schools to fully support students. That is why we need funding to procure more staff and train them. It is also vital to fund training for existing teachers and staff in schools where it is not possible to provide them with social workers or psychologists. The school training does not need to cover the full education that these professionals may have, but establishing baseline knowledge on ACEs and race-informed, trauma-informed care will better situate them to respond to students' needs. For schools that do not have enough personnel, this training is still necessary for everyone to have baseline knowledge in order to support their students of color by recognizing the impact of racism. The staff involved should first be educated on what trauma is, including historical and racial trauma. Trauma should be defined as an event or series of events, an experience or prolonged experiences, and/or a threat to a person's well-being. Children's exposure to trauma may overwhelm their ability to cope and may cause increased anxiety, depression, symptoms of PTSD, difficulty managing relationships, and most important for educators, difficulty with school and learning. Staff should be able to recognize and respond to the effects of trauma depending on the child's age, which will be discussed next. Staff should be trained on the differences between positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress, and their impact on health and well-being. The HEADS assessment will be discussed later to provide staff with a method of questioning. As always, staff should weigh the risks of any intervention. Next, Nyla will now cover the rest of this section.
Thank you, Jocelyn. As mentioned on the previous slide, school staff should know how to respond to the effects of trauma by age. Children at different stages of development have varying responses and have different needs in terms of support and intervention. Children ages 3 to 5 may exhibit behaviors including recreating the traumatic event or having difficulties with sleeping, eating, or reaction to loud sounds or sudden movements. Children ages 6 to 11 may exhibit a variety of reactions to trauma and racial trauma in particular. School-aged children tend to view media coverage in personal terms, worrying that a similar event could happen to them. This can lead to preoccupations with their own safety or that of their friends, which in turn can lead to distractibility and problems in school. Children ages 12 to 17 typically have a better understanding of events and the implications of issues such as racial trauma. High school-age students may become fixated on events as a way of trying to cope or deal with anxiety. They may benefit from discussing ways that they can promote positive changes in their communities. By increasing funding to train staff with a race-informed, trauma-informed approach, we will be connecting students to quality support and any necessary intervention to prevent or mitigate the effects of ACEs and trauma. Staff who interact with children and adolescents should take a developmentally appropriate approach to assessing psychosocial history. The HEADS assessment has been used successfully around the world in the adolescent healthcare field and would prove to be useful for middle school and high school age students. This method structures questions to facilitate communication and to create a sympathetic, confidential, respectful environment where students may be able to attain adequate care. HEADS stands for Home, Education, and Employment, Peer Group Activities, Drugs, Sexuality, Suicide, and Depression. The HEADS assessment can be conducted by counselors, social workers, or psychologists if they are in the school. This will be a part of the training they will receive. If schools have an affiliate clinic, professionals at the clinic should conduct the assessment, but the results should be available for the school to reference if the child and their guardian agree to share that information. The assessment questions are available in English, but if needed, the questions can be translated in a more appropriate language for the child. If a teacher notices some concerning behaviors in a child, they can refer the child to a counselor, social worker, or psychologist where they will begin the HEADS assessment to understand what is happening in their life. As mentioned, if there's an affiliate clinic, then the professionals at that site would conduct the assessment. This conversation should begin with an introduction and understanding of confidentiality, followed by questions on the home environment. Questions will go on to ask about their experiences related to education and employment, followed by any peer group activities they participate in. The questions about drugs, sexuality, and suicide or depression may be difficult topics to talk about, which is why it is important to create a safe and brave environment. Wrapping up the interview should include any thoughts the child has on the process or other life events. Once the school staff understands their students' experiences, they can decide on what is the best course of action. Resilience is a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. This does not mean that a child will not experience difficulty or distress. The most important action in building resilience is prioritizing and building strong relationships between children and caregivers and other supportive adults. These connections have been proven to buffer the negative effects of trauma and stress. It is just as vital to foster wellness through healthy lifestyles, including adequate sleep, nutritious food, water, and exercise. Practicing mindfulness activities can also help build connections and restore hope. Keeping a positive outlook may be difficult, but supportive relationships can help students achieve this mindset. Seeking help when needed is also crucial to building resilience. Children should be comfortable using the resources around them and in using strategies they have learned, but staff should always be available if they require more guidance. Tahaya will now go over available funding that can be allocated to this training.
Thank you, Nyla. There are several ways legislation can prevent and mitigate the effects of ACEs caused or exacerbated by racism. In order to procure the proper staff, including psychologists and social workers, schools need direct funding to hire and sustain them. These roles are essential for identification of behaviors and necessary intervention for children. It is also necessary to develop and implement standardized training across all schools in the district in order to have consistent organization and responses that can be evaluated over time to inform any necessary modifications. This training has been discussed earlier in the presentation, but should include recognizing behaviors related to ACEs and how staff should interact and proceed with the affected child. In addition to this training, there should be an established course of action for all staff roles in aiding children displaying concerning behaviors, including plans in directing help to a child. In cases where children are displaying concerning behaviors, there should be plans for possible courses of intervention with the least possible risk for the children. There has been a recent upsurge of political momentum in support of trauma-informed care, policies, and interventions. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 is a comprehensive funding package to address the various negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. There are a number of provisions that allow funding for trauma-informed programs or to address issues that contribute to childhood trauma. Specifically, over $100 billion has been set aside for local educational agencies to address needs of low-income children, provide mental health services and support, including trauma-informed care to address increased trauma from the pandemic, and implement evidence-based activities to meet the needs of students. New York Senate Bill S8304 introduces an amendment to the mental hygiene law to develop curricula for and mandate continuing education for teachers relating to mental health issues and trauma-informed care. It specifically lists adverse childhood experiences as one of the included concepts for training. It stipulates 10 hours of the required 100 hours of continuing teacher and leader education training should be spent on mental health issues and trauma-informed care. The Strong Support for Children Act was introduced by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts and Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York in October 2020. The act aims to improve outcomes for children in areas with a high prevalence of trauma from exposure to adverse childhood experiences and other purposes by introducing 2 new grant programs. The grant programs would support local public health departments in addressing trauma via accessible programming, regardless of immigration status, prior criminal justice involvement, or ability to pay. On the backs of this new wave of legislation, we propose the addition of a race-informed approach to trauma-informed care. We must capitalize on these existing legislature and funding opportunities dedicated to trauma-informed care and include a race-informed approach to these initiatives in New York City schools and communities. This is the end of the presentation section of this webinar on why and how to implement race-informed, trauma-informed care in schools. We would like to acknowledge the following people who helped make this webinar possible. We will now briefly give an overview of our available companion pieces.
We would like to highlight our first companion piece for school districts to distribute, which is a trifold on how to talk about racism with students. This is the outside of the trifold with sections on key terms and additional resources such as books, podcasts, and articles. This is the inside of the trifold with the first section noting the difficulty many people have in talking about racism, followed by a section on the breakdown of suggested steps for engaging in these conversations. The right section focuses on individual level steps that can be taken to develop necessary skills needed for dialogue.
This pamphlet is our second companion piece meant to be used as a resource for local policymakers, which displays the prevalence and cost burden of ACEs in New York State. Data for New York City is currently lacking, so New York State is our best reference. In order to reduce these costs, early intervention is necessary in order to identify signs of trauma and provide the necessary resources to children and adolescents. The left side shows the full-size version of the pamphlet, and the two images to the right are zoomed in for the purposes of viewing in this presentation. Thank you for participating in this webinar. For more information and to access to other webinars, please visit traumafreenyc.cumc.columbia.edu.